I never thought the words "stay away from us" would come from my own son's mouth. Not from David. Not from the little boy I held when he had nightmares. The teenager I helped with homework until midnight. The young man whose wedding I helped plan with tears of joy streaming down my face. But there I was, standing in what used to be my second home, their beautiful suburban house with the white picket fence I'd helped paint last spring, watching my son's face transform into something cold and unrecognizable. His wife Jessica stood behind him, her arms crossed, her expression carrying that particular satisfaction that comes from watching someone else's world crumble. "Mom, I think it's best if you take some space from us," David said, unable to meet my eyes directly. His voice wavered slightly, like he was reading from a script he hadn't quite memorized. "Jessica and I have talked, and we need to focus on our family right now." Their family. As if I wasn't family. As if 28 years of being his mother had been some kind of trial membership that could be revoked without warning. I'd been living with them for 3 months since my apartment lease ended, and I'd been between jobs. 3 months of cooking their meals, cleaning their house, taking care of little Emma when they worked late. 3 months of watching Jessica's resentment grow like a tumor, fed by whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. "I don't understand," I managed to whisper, my hands trembling as I clutched the dish towel I'd been holding when this conversation started. "What did I do wrong?" Jessica stepped forward then, her perfectly manicured nails catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows I'd cleaned just that morning. "It's not about what you did wrong, Maria. It's about what's right for our family. We need our privacy, our space to grow as a couple. Privacy." As if my presence in the guest room somehow contaminated their marriage, as if the woman who'd raised their breadwinner was now a threat to their happiness. I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent countless hours preparing family dinners, where little Emma had learned to walk holding onto my fingers, where I'd helped Jessica plan her baby shower just 2 years ago. The refrigerator still displayed Emma's drawings that she'd insisted I help her create. Crayon butterflies and stick figure families that included Grandma Maria with a big smile and purple dress. "What about Emma?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "She's expecting me to read to her tonight. We're halfway through Charlotte's Web." "Emma will be fine," Jessica said quickly, too quickly. "Children are resilient. She'll adjust." But I saw something flicker in David's eyes then. Doubt, maybe guilt. He knew how much Emma loved our reading time, how she'd started calling me Grandma Maria instead of just Grandma, because it made her feel special. He knew that I was the one who remembered which bedtime story she wanted on which night, who knew that she liked her peanut butter sandwiches cut diagonally, who understood that her favorite stuffed rabbit needed to be facing the door, or she couldn't fall asleep. "I've already packed your things," Jessica continued, gesturing toward 2 suitcases sitting by the front door like silent sentinels of my exile. "I was very careful with your belongings. Very careful." The phrase stung because it was probably true. Jessica had always been methodical, organized. She'd probably folded my clothes with the same precision she used for everything else, checking items off some mental list as she systematically erased my presence from their home. Those suitcases represented everything I owned in the world. 55 years of life reduced to whatever could fit in 2 pieces of luggage. My photo albums, my mother's jewelry, the quilted blanket I'd made during those long months when David was deployed overseas, when I'd stayed up nights worrying and stitching, creating something beautiful to keep my hands busy and my mind from spiraling into dark places. Where am I supposed to go? The question came out smaller than I'd intended, more vulnerable than I wanted to appear in front of Jessica, who seemed to view any display of emotion as a kind of weakness. "You're a grown woman, Maria," she said, her tone carrying that particular condescension reserved for people she considered somehow inferior. "I'm sure you'll figure something out." But David looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he used to do as a child when he'd been caught in a lie. "Mom, you can stay with Aunt Rosa for a while, right? Just until you get back on your feet?" Aunt Rosa, my sister-in-law who lived 40 miles away in a 1-bedroom apartment and hadn't spoken to me in 6 months after our argument about her son's gambling problem. The same Rosa who'd made it clear that family obligations had limits, and those limits didn't extend to housing displaced relatives indefinitely. I wanted to tell him that Rosa's place wasn't an option, that I had nowhere to go, that the job market for 55-year-old women with gaps in their employment history wasn't exactly abundant with opportunities. I wanted to remind him of all the times I'd been there for him, through his divorce from his first wife, through his struggles with depression, through the terrifying months when baby Emma was in the NICU fighting for her life, and I'd slept in hospital waiting rooms so I could be there whenever he needed me. Instead, I nodded. What else could I do? Make a scene? Beg my own son to let me stay in the house where I'd been contributing rent money from my meager savings? Force him to acknowledge that his wife had manipulated him into choosing between his marriage and his mother, and he'd chosen his marriage? I understand, I said quietly, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. I walked to the front door where my suitcases waited like evidence of some crime I couldn't remember committing. Behind me, I could hear Jessica's voice, bright and cheerful now that she'd gotten what she wanted. This is really for the best, Maria. You'll see. Sometimes families need boundaries to stay healthy. Boundaries. Another buzzword she'd probably learned from some self-help book or therapy session designed to help people justify their cruelty with psychological terminology. As I reached for the first suitcase, I heard little Emma's voice calling from upstairs. Grandma Maria, is it story time yet? The sound pierced through me like a physical wound. This innocent child who'd done nothing wrong, who loved me unconditionally, who was about to discover that the woman who'd been a constant presence in her life had simply vanished without explanation. I'll tell her you had to go away for a while, David said softly. And for a moment, he sounded like my little boy again, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I picked up both suitcases, their weight heavier than it should have been, burdened with more than just clothes and belongings. At the door, I turned back one last time. Take care of each other, I said, looking directly at my son, trying to memorize his face because I didn't know when, or if, I'd see it again. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded final as a coffin lid. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the garden I'd helped plant, at the mailbox I'd painted with cheerful yellow flowers, at the swing set in the backyard where Emma and I had spent so many afternoons talking about everything and nothing. Then I put one foot in front of the other and walked away from the life I'd thought was mine to keep. The motel room smelled of industrial disinfectant and other people's desperation. $42 a night was all I could afford, and even that was stretching my savings to dangerous limits. The bedspread had cigarette burns and stains I didn't want to identify, but it was a roof over my head, which was more than I'd had 3 hours ago when I'd driven away from David's house with nowhere to go. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone, willing it to ring. Maybe David would call to apologize, to say Jessica had gone too far, that he'd realized his mistake. Maybe little Emma would ask for me, and they'd have to admit that tearing apart a family wasn't as simple as packing suitcases and pointing toward the door. But the phone remained silent, its screen reflecting my face back at me, older than I remembered, more tired, marked by lines that hadn't been there this morning when I'd been making breakfast for my family, believing I still had a place in their world. I tried calling my sister Rosa anyway, even though I knew what the answer would be. The phone rang 4 times before her familiar voice, sharp with irritation, filled the cramped space. Maria, it's late. What do you want? Rosa, I need help. The words stuck in my throat like broken glass. David asked me to leave their house, and I don't have anywhere to go. A long pause. In the background, I could hear her television, some late-night talk show where people laughed at jokes that probably weren't funny, where everyone pretended life was lighter than it actually was. I told you living with them was a mistake, she said finally. I told you that daughter-in-law of yours would cause problems. You never listen. You were right, I admitted, hating myself for the admission but desperate enough to swallow my pride. But I need somewhere to stay, just for a few days while I figure things out. Maria, you know my situation. I've got Miguel's kids every other weekend now since his divorce, and the apartment barely has room for me. Besides, I can't afford another mouth to feed. as if I were some stray animal rather than her brother's widow, as if the 20 years we'd shared family dinners and holidays meant nothing when faced with the inconvenience of helping someone in crisis. "I can help with expenses," I said quickly. "I have some savings left and I'm looking for work." "At your age?" "Maria, be realistic. You're 55 with no skills except taking care of other people's houses and children. Who's going to hire you when they can get someone younger for less money?" Her words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to remind me of my worthlessness in a world that measured human value by earning potential and youth. The worst part was that she wasn't being deliberately cruel. She was just stating what she saw as obvious facts, delivering harsh truths with the casual indifference of someone who'd never had to face them herself. "I'll figure something out," I said, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "You do that. And Maria? Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. Maybe it's time you learn to stand on your own 2 feet instead of always depending on other people." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, trying to process the conversation. Depending on other people. As if my entire adult life hadn't been spent taking care of everyone else. My husband during his long illness, my son through his struggles, my granddaughter who needed more attention than her working parents could provide. I'd worked multiple jobs to put David through college after his father died, cleaning offices at night and watching neighbors' children during the day. I'd sold my mother's jewelry to help pay for his wedding, had given up my own apartment to provide childcare when Emma was born. But apparently, needing help now made me dependent, weak, a burden no one wanted to carry. The next morning, I drove to the few places I thought might offer employment. Grocery stores, retail shops, restaurants that might need someone for part-time work. Each interview followed the same pattern. Polite interest that faded the moment they saw my age on the application, concerned questions about my recent employment gap, promises to keep my resume on file, that we both knew meant nothing. At the third restaurant, a family-owned diner that advertised home cooking and friendly service, the manager, a woman about my age with tired eyes and practical shoes, looked at my application with something that might have been sympathy. "Honey, I wish I could help you," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. "But I need people who can work nights and weekends, who can lift heavy trays and stand for 8 hours straight. At our age, that's not easy, and the customers, they expect young, pretty girls who smile no matter how badly they're treated." Young, pretty girls. I looked down at my hands, noting the age spots and prominent veins that betrayed my decades of work, of caring for others, of trying to hold everything together. When had I become invisible? When had my experience and reliability become less valuable than youth and inexperience? I spent the afternoon in a public library, using their free internet to search for jobs, apartments, any lifeline that might keep me from drowning in circumstances I hadn't created and couldn't control. But every apartment required first and last month's rent, plus deposit. Money I didn't have. Every job wanted references from recent employers, availability for schedules that conflicted with other survival necessities, skills I'd never had reason to develop. Around 4 o'clock, as I sat surrounded by homeless people using the library for shelter and teenagers avoiding going home, my phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart jumped. Maybe David had realized his mistake. Maybe Emma had asked for me. Maybe family bonds were stronger than Jessica's manipulation. But it was Jessica's number on the screen. "Maria, Emma has been asking for you. Please don't contact her directly. It's confusing for a child her age, and we're trying to help her adjust. We think a clean break is best for everyone." A clean break. As if love could be severed like a rope. As if the bond between grandmother and grandchild could be dismissed with clinical efficiency. As if Emma's confusion and pain were acceptable casualties in Jessica's campaign to erase my presence from their lives. I stared at the message until the words blurred together, until my eyes burned with tears I refused to shed in this public place surrounded by strangers who had their own problems to worry about. The worst part wasn't the cruelty, it was the calculated nature of it. Jessica had specifically waited until Emma asked for me to send this message, timing it for maximum impact, ensuring I understood that even my granddaughter's love would be used as a weapon against me. That evening, back in the motel room that was beginning to feel less like temporary shelter and more like a prison cell, I tried to eat the sandwich I'd bought from a gas station. The bread was stale and the lunch meat questionable, but it was cheap protein that might sustain me for another day of job hunting and apartment searching. The walls were thin enough that I could hear everything happening in adjacent rooms. A couple arguing about money. A television turned up too loud. Someone crying behind walls that provided privacy but no real isolation from human misery. I was surrounded by other people who'd fallen through society's cracks, who'd discovered that the safety nets they'd believed in were more theoretical than real. I thought about Emma, probably asking Jessica where Grandma Maria had gone, why I wasn't there to read the next chapter of Charlotte's Web. I thought about David, hopefully feeling the first pangs of guilt as he realized what he'd lost. What he'd sacrificed for a marriage that demanded he choose between his wife and his mother. I thought about my husband, gone 5 years now, who would have been horrified to see his son abandon his mother when she needed family most. But mostly, I thought about the growing certainty that this was my life now. A series of motel rooms and rejection letters, an existence defined by what I'd lost rather than what I still had to offer. The woman who'd raised a successful son, who'd helped bring a beautiful granddaughter into the world, who'd contributed to every household she'd ever been part of, had become invisible, expendable, worth less than the comfort of people who'd once depended on her for everything. Outside my window, the neon sign flickered between vacancy and darkness, casting red shadows across walls that had witnessed countless stories of human failure and resilience. Tomorrow I'd get up and try again, because that's what survivors do. But tonight, in this room that smelled of other people's desperation, I finally understood that sometimes love isn't enough to hold a family together when one person decides that love is inconvenient. 5 days into my exile, I finally swallowed what remained of my pride and drove to David's workplace. The gleaming office building downtown housed the accounting firm where he'd built his career, where he'd worked his way up from junior associate to senior manager, where his colleagues knew him as a dedicated professional, but had no idea his mother was currently sleeping in a motel room and eating convenience store food. I waited in the parking garage for 3 hours, watching employees come and go during their lunch breaks, before I finally saw his familiar figure walking toward his silver sedan. He looked successful in his tailored suit and polished shoes, every inch the responsible family man who'd somehow convinced himself that abandoning his mother was a necessary sacrifice for his marriage. David. I called his name softly, not wanting to startle him or create a scene that might embarrass him in front of colleagues who might be watching from office windows. He turned, and for a split second, his face showed pure relief, as if seeing me reminded him that I was real, that I was his mother, that the woman who'd raised him hadn't simply evaporated like some inconvenient memory. But then his expression shuttered closed, replaced by the careful blankness he'd been practicing since Jessica started poisoning his mind against me. "Mom, what are you doing here? I needed to see you, to talk to you without Jessica monitoring every word." I stepped closer, noting how he instinctively backed toward his car, as if my presence might contaminate his professional image. "David, I'm your mother. Whatever problems you and Jessica are having, we can work through them together." "There are no problems," he said quickly, too quickly. "We're fine. Everything is fine." But his hands were shaking as he fumbled with his car keys, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes when he spoke. This was my son, the boy I'd read to every night, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose nightmares I'd chased away with silly songs and warm milk. I could read his distress as clearly as I'd once read bedtime stories. "You don't look fine," I said gently. "You look exhausted. Are you sleeping? Are you eating properly?" "Jessica takes good care of me," he replied, but even as he said it, something flickered across his face. Doubt, maybe, or the memory of how I used to take care of him, how I'd made sure he had everything he needed without making it feel like a burden or obligation. "I'm sure she does. But David, I'm worried about Emma. She must be confused about why I disappeared. Children need consistency, especially at her age." His face crumpled slightly at the mention of his daughter, and I saw my opening, the crack in his resolve that proved he wasn't completely lost to Jessica's manipulation. "She has been asking about you," he admitted quietly, glancing around the parking garage as if Jessica might materialize from behind a concrete pillar. She doesn't understand why you're not there anymore. Last night she drew you a picture, and when she asked Jessica if she could call you, Jessica said, she said you didn't want to talk to Emma anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow. Jessica was using my granddaughter's love for me as another weapon, poisoning an innocent child's understanding of family loyalty and unconditional love. Emma was probably lying in her bed wondering what she'd done wrong, why Grandma Maria had stopped loving her enough to stay. You know that's not true, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the echo of car engines in the concrete space. You know I would never abandon Emma. I would never abandon any of you. I know, he said, and for a moment he sounded like my little boy again, lost and confused, and needing his mother to make everything make sense. But Jessica says, she says you're being manipulative, that you're trying to guilt me into choosing sides. What sides, David? We're family. There shouldn't be sides. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his keys as if they held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and something that might have been regret. She says you resent her for having the life you never got to have. The nice house, the successful husband, the secure future. She says you're jealous and that's why you create problems. The accusation was so absurd, so completely contrary to everything I'd ever felt about Jessica and David's marriage, that I almost laughed. Jealous? Of a woman who'd systematically isolated my son from his family? Of a marriage that required choosing between spouse and mother? Of a life built on manipulation and emotional blackmail? David, I was proud of you for finding someone who made you happy. I helped plan your wedding, remember? I was the one who told you to propose when you were afraid she might say no. How is that jealousy? I remember, he said softly. But Jessica says people change. She says maybe you were supportive before, but living with us made you bitter about your own choices. It was like watching my son disappear before my eyes, replaced by someone who spoke Jessica's words in his voice, who'd been so thoroughly brainwashed that he couldn't distinguish between his own thoughts and hers anymore. Every conversation we'd had, every moment of connection, every expression of love had been reinterpreted through Jessica's lens until my son genuinely believed that his mother was the enemy. If I'm so terrible, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, then why do you look miserable? Why do you look like you haven't slept in days? I'm fine, he repeated, but his voice cracked slightly. I'm just adjusting. We all are. Adjusting to what? To treating family like disposable objects? To teaching Emma that love comes with conditions? Don't. His voice turned sharp, defensive. Don't lecture me about parenting. You had your chance to raise your child. Emma is mine and Jessica's responsibility. The words landed like a slap, carrying years of accumulated resentment I hadn't known existed. Your chance to raise your child, as if my years of sacrifice and love had been some kind of probationary period that had ended when he reached adulthood, as if becoming a parent himself had somehow invalidated everything I'd given him. I see, I said quietly. So all those years of working 2 jobs to pay for your college, all those nights I spent helping you with homework, all those times I listened to you cry about girlfriends and career disappointments, that was just me having my chance to raise a child? And now that you're grown, I'm supposed to disappear quietly so Jessica can have her perfect nuclear family? That's not what I meant, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Because that's exactly what you've done. You've erased me from your life like I was some kind of obstacle to your happiness instead of the woman who made your happiness possible. A couple of his colleagues walked past us toward their cars, chatting about weekend plans and office politics, living normal lives where families supported each other instead of systematically destroying each other. David watched them nervously, clearly anxious about being seen having this conversation with a woman who looked increasingly desperate despite her efforts to maintain dignity. I have to go, he said, finally getting his car door open. Jessica will be wondering where I am. Jessica will be wondering where you are, I repeated. When did you become someone who has to account for every minute to his wife? When did you stop being allowed to have conversations with your own mother? It's not like that, he protested. but he was already getting into his car, already retreating from a conversation that might force him to confront uncomfortable truths about what his marriage had cost him. "Call me," I said quickly, before he could close the door. "Or let me call Emma. Let me explain that I didn't choose to leave her." "I can't," he said, not meeting my eyes. "It would just make things harder for everyone." "Harder for Jessica, you mean?" He started the car without answering, backing out of his parking space with the careful attention of someone who didn't trust his emotional state behind the wheel. I watched him drive away, my successful son in his expensive car, fleeing from his mother like I was some kind of threat to his carefully constructed life. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 40 years. I sat in a church. Not because I'd suddenly found religion, but because it was warm and quiet and free, and the sanctuary offered a peace that my motel room couldn't provide. The building was old and beautiful, with stained glass windows that cast colored shadows across wooden pews worn smooth by generations of people seeking comfort. I wasn't the only one there seeking refuge. An elderly man sat several rows ahead, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A young woman knelt in the front pew, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been arguments with God. A homeless man slept in a back corner, and no one bothered him, as if the church understood that sometimes sanctuary meant nothing more than a safe place to rest. I thought about David's face in the parking garage, the way he'd looked both relieved and terrified to see me. I thought about Emma drawing pictures I'd never see, asking questions no one would answer honestly. I thought about Jessica, methodically destroying a family while convincing herself she was protecting it. But mostly, I thought about how efficiently love could be weaponized, how easily family bonds could be severed when one person decided that love was inconvenient. I'd spent my entire adult life believing that family was sacred, that the connections between mother and child, grandmother and grandchild, were stronger than temporary conflicts and outside influences. Now I was learning that love without power was just sentiment, and sentiment could be discarded whenever it became inconvenient for people who valued comfort over loyalty. 2 weeks had passed since that encounter in the parking garage, and David hadn't called. 2 weeks of checking my phone every few minutes, of jumping at every notification, of lying awake in motel rooms that all looked the same and smelled of industrial cleaning products and broken dreams. 2 weeks of watching my savings dwindle to amounts that made me count quarters like a child counting birthday money. I'd applied for every job within a 20-mile radius that didn't require experience I didn't have or energy I could no longer sustain. Fast food restaurants where managers half my age looked at me with polite pity. Retail stores where the uniform sizes stopped before they reached the body of a 55-year-old woman who'd carried and nursed children. Cleaning services that wanted workers who could lift 40 pounds and work on their knees for hours without complaint. Each rejection felt like another small death. Another confirmation that I'd become invisible in a world that measured worth by youth and productivity. The woman who'd raised a successful son, who'd managed households and budgets and crises with quiet competence, had somehow become unemployable, unwanted, unnecessary. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I walked into a discount store where the manager, a tired-looking woman about my daughter-in-law's age, barely glanced at my application before sliding it back across the counter. "I'm sorry, but we're looking for someone with more recent retail experience," she said, her voice carrying the practiced dismissal of someone who'd delivered bad news so often it had lost any pretense of genuine regret. "I worked retail before my son was born," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. 28 years ago, but I remember 28 years ago," she interrupted, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone stating an obvious fact. "Things have changed. The computer systems, the customer service protocols, the pace of work. We need someone who can hit the ground running. Hit the ground running." Another phrase that meant someone younger, someone who won't require training or patience or the basic human courtesy of giving experience a chance to prove its worth. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward, staring at the steering wheel while tears I'd been holding back for days finally escaped. Not the gentle crying of someone processing grief, but the ugly sobbing of someone whose last hope had just been systematically destroyed by economic realities that didn't care about individual circumstances or human dignity. A young mother walked past my car, pushing a stroller while talking on her phone, probably arranging childcare or discussing dinner plans with someone who cared about her daily life. I watched her with a mixture of envy and remembrance, thinking about all the times I'd been that woman. Busy, needed, essential to other people's happiness and security. When had I stopped being essential? When had my presence become optional, then unwanted, then actively harmful to the people I loved most? That afternoon, I drove past David's house for the first time since he'd asked me to leave. I told myself I was just in the neighborhood, just taking a longer route back to the motel. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. I missed them so desperately that even glimpsing their house felt like a form of contact. The yard looked different already. The flower beds I'd maintained were showing signs of neglect. Weeds poking through mulch that was no longer fresh. Plants that needed watering or deadheading that no one was attending to. The cheerful yellow paint on the mailbox had a chip near the bottom where the neighborhood cat liked to sharpen his claws. A small flaw I'd been meaning to touch up before I was exiled from their lives. Jessica's car was in the driveway, but David's wasn't. He was probably still at work, earning money to support the family that had decided he needed protection from his own mother. I wondered if Emma was inside, maybe coloring at the kitchen table where I used to help her with art projects, maybe asking Jessica when Grandma Maria would come back from her mysterious trip. As I sat there, remembering afternoons spent in that house thinking I was building memories instead of setting myself up for heartbreak, Jessica emerged from the front door. She was dressed casually but expensively, yoga pants that probably cost more than I spent on food in a week, a designer handbag that represented someone's monthly rent payment. She walked to her mailbox with the confident stride of someone whose place in the world was secure and unquestioned. Someone who'd never had to worry about sleeping in cheap motels or being rejected for employment because of her age. As she sorted through letters and catalogs, she glanced up and saw my car. For a moment, we made eye contact across the distance that separated her driveway from the street where I'd parked. I could see the exact instant she recognized me, could watch her face transform from casual indifference to sharp alarm. She looked around quickly, as if checking to see if any neighbors were witnessing this violation of the boundaries she'd established. Then she did something that cut deeper than any words could have. She smiled. Not a friendly smile or even a polite acknowledgement, but the satisfied smile of someone who'd won a battle and wanted to make sure the loser understood the completeness of their defeat. She raised her hand in a little wave, the kind of gesture that looked neighborly and normal to anyone who might be watching, but carried a clear message to me. This is my territory now, and you're trespassing just by being here. I drove away without returning the wave, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as the full reality of my situation finally crashed over me like a wave I'd been watching approach from a distance. I wasn't just homeless and unemployed. I was completely alone in the world, cut off from the only family I had by a woman who viewed my love for my son and granddaughter as a threat to be eliminated. That night, I sat on the edge of the motel bed that had become my entire living space and tried to eat a sandwich I'd bought from a gas station. The bread was stale and the meat questionable, but it was food, and food was something I could no longer take for granted. Each bite felt like swallowing my own failure, my own irrelevance in a world that had moved on without me. I thought about calling David again, but what would I say that I hadn't already said? That I missed him? That I was worried about Emma? That his wife was systematically destroying his relationship with his mother, and he was too manipulated to see it? I'd already tried honesty, and honesty had been dismissed as manipulation. I thought about showing up at Emma's school, waiting to see her during pickup time, maybe getting a chance to explain that I hadn't chosen to leave her. But Jessica had probably already warned the school about me. Probably painted me as some kind of unstable grandmother who posed a threat to the child's well-being. I thought about writing letters, to David, to Emma, to anyone who might listen. But what was the point of words when the people you loved had been convinced that your very existence was harmful to their happiness? For the first time since this nightmare began, I understood why some people simply disappeared from their own lives. Why they drove away from everything familiar and started over somewhere else where no one knew their history or their failures. Why they chose the loneliness of strangers over the rejection of family. The television in my room flickered between channels automatically, a broken mechanism that seemed fitting for my circumstances. never staying on one thing long enough to provide comfort or distraction, just an endless cycle of images and sounds that meant nothing and changed nothing. Outside my window, the motel's neon sign buzzed and sparked, its light casting red shadows across walls that had witnessed countless stories of human desperation. I was just another casualty in a building full of people who'd fallen through society's cracks. Another woman who'd discovered that love and sacrifice and devotion counted for nothing when weighed against convenience and control. I pulled my mother's quilt around my shoulders, the one thing in my suitcase that still smelled like home, like the woman who'd raised me to believe that family was sacred and love was permanent. She'd made this quilt during long winter evenings, each stitch a prayer for her daughter's future happiness, each pattern piece carefully chosen to create something beautiful and lasting. But I still had something. I realized as I traced the familiar stitching with my finger. Something Jessica didn't know about. Something David had forgotten. Something that they'd overlooked in their careful campaign to erase me from their lives. I had memories. I had love that couldn't be legislated away by manipulation or cruelty. I had knowledge of my son and granddaughter that went deeper than Jessica's recent claims on their affection. And sometimes, I was beginning to understand. Memories and love and knowledge were enough to sustain someone through the darkness. Sometimes they were enough to remind you that you were more than other people's opinion of your worth. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile, too likely to be crushed by the next rejection or humiliation. But it was something else. A quiet certainty that this wasn't the end of my story, even if I couldn't yet see what the next chapter might bring. The neon sign flickered one more time and went dark, leaving my room in the kind of complete darkness that forces you to confront who you really are when no one else is watching. And in that darkness, for the first time in weeks, I found something that felt almost like peace. The morning everything changed started like any other. I'd been living in that motel for 3 weeks, existing on convenience store food, and the dwindling hope that something, anything, might shift in my favor. I was down to my last $40 when the call came. Not from David, not from Emma, from Linda Patterson, a woman I barely knew who worked at Emma's daycare center. Her voice was shaky when she spoke, careful in the way people sound when they're delivering news that will change everything. "Mrs. Gonzalez? This is Linda from Sunshine Kids Daycare. I got your number from the emergency contact list before it was updated. Before Jessica had me removed from every list, every contact form, every official acknowledgement that I'd ever been part of my granddaughter's life. There's been an accident," Linda continued. "Emma fell from the playground equipment about an hour ago. She's conscious, but she has a head injury and she's asking for you. She keeps saying she wants Grandma Maria." My heart stopped. Then it started beating so fast I thought I might collapse right there on the stained carpet of room 237. "Where is she? Which hospital?" "St. Mary's Emergency. Mrs. Gonzalez, I probably shouldn't have called you, but she's so scared and she won't let the nurses touch her. She keeps asking why you haven't come to see her, why you don't love her anymore." The words hit me like physical blows. While I'd been sitting in motel rooms feeling sorry for myself, my granddaughter had been told that I'd abandoned her. While I'd been checking my phone hoping for contact from David, Emma had been crying herself to sleep, wondering what she'd done to make Grandma Maria stop loving her. "I'm coming," I said, already grabbing my keys, already moving toward the door of a room I suddenly couldn't wait to escape. "Tell her Grandma Maria is coming." The drive to the hospital took forever and no time at all. I broke every speed limit while trying not to imagine Emma lying on a hospital bed, confused and hurt, and believing that the woman who'd read her stories every night had simply decided to disappear from her life. I thought about Jessica's cruelty in using a child's love as a weapon, in poisoning an innocent mind with lies designed to serve adult conflicts. When I arrived at the emergency room, I could hear Emma before I could see her. Her voice, higher than normal with fear and pain, calling out in the particular way children cry when they want their mother, but will settle for anyone who represents safety and unconditional love. "I want Grandma Maria. Where is Grandma Maria? She promised she'd always take care of me." The sound nearly brought me to my knees right there in the hospital corridor. This child who'd done nothing wrong, who'd loved me without reservation, had been told that promises could be broken, that love could disappear, that the adults in her world weren't as reliable as she'd believed. I found her room and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene that would haunt me forever if I didn't act. Emma lay on a hospital bed that made her look impossibly small, her head wrapped in white bandages, her face streaked with tears. David sat beside her, holding her hand, but looking helpless in the way parents do when they can't fix their child's pain. Jessica stood near the window, her phone pressed to her ear, conducting what sounded like business calls while her stepdaughter suffered. "Grandma Maria!" Emma's voice cut through every other sound in the room when she saw me. "You came! I knew you'd come! Daddy said you didn't want to see me anymore, but I knew that wasn't true." I moved to her bedside without looking at David or Jessica, focused entirely on this child who'd been caught in the crossfire of adult cruelty. Emma reached for me with the good arm that wasn't connected to IV lines, and I took her small hand in both of mine, feeling how fragile she was, how much she'd needed someone who understood that love doesn't disappear just because circumstances become inconvenient. "I'm here, baby," I whispered, brushing tears from her cheeks with gentle fingers. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Why didn't you come before? I drew you pictures and Mommy Jessica said you didn't want them. I asked Daddy to call you and he said you were busy with other things." The lies they'd told her, the systematic destruction of a child's understanding of unconditional love, filled me with a rage I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about a little girl who'd been taught that love could be withdrawn as punishment, that family bonds could be severed by adult convenience. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," I said carefully, aware that David and Jessica were listening to every word, but caring only about Emma's need for honesty. "Sometimes they think they're protecting people they love, but they make the wrong choices. I never stopped loving you, and I never stopped wanting to see you. But Mommy Jessica said—" "Mommy Jessica was wrong," I interrupted gently but firmly, making eye contact with Jessica for the first time since entering the room. "And Daddy was wrong too. Sometimes grown-ups get confused about what's really important." David looked like he might speak, might try to defend the indefensible, but something in my expression stopped him. Maybe it was the sight of his daughter's obvious relief at having me there. Maybe it was the recognition that his wife's campaign against me had crossed a line when it began hurting his child. Maybe it was simple guilt finally breaking through the fog of manipulation that had clouded his judgment for months. Jessica ended her phone call and approached the bed with the measured steps of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond her management. "Maria, I think it's best if you leave," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her wishes treated as commands. "Emma needs to rest, and having you here will only confuse her more." "The only thing confusing Emma," I said, still holding my granddaughter's hand but looking directly at Jessica, "is why the adults in her life have been lying to her about where I've been. We've been protecting her from what? From love? From stability? From the woman who's been part of her life since the day she was born?" Emma looked back and forth between us, her young mind trying to process adult conflicts that had nothing to do with her, but everything to do with her future understanding of how families should work. I could see her confusion, but also her relief at finally having someone tell her the truth instead of elaborate stories designed to justify inexplicable adult behavior. "Grandma Maria," she said softly, "are you going to stay now? Are you going to read me stories again?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone in the room to confront what this moment really meant. Jessica's face went rigid with the realization that her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in front of her stepdaughter's hospital bed. David looked torn between his wife and his daughter, finally seeing the real cost of the choices he'd been making. But I wasn't looking at them anymore. I was looking at Emma, at this brave little girl who'd been hurt physically and emotionally, but was still capable of hope, still willing to believe that love could be stronger than the forces trying to destroy it. "I'm going to try," I told her, and for the first time in weeks, the words felt like a promise I might actually be able to keep. The nurse who'd been checking Emma's vital signs cleared her throat diplomatically. "The doctor wants to keep her for observation overnight," she said, addressing David but including me in her glance. "Head injuries in children require careful monitoring." She's going to need someone with her who can keep her calm and comfortable. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, probably to establish that she would be staying, but Emma's voice cut through any adult negotiations. "I want Grandma Maria to stay with me," she announced with the clear certainty that only children possess. "She knows which stories help me sleep, and she knows about the special song for when I'm scared." It was such a simple request from such a small person, but it carried the weight of months of manipulation and lies and systematic cruelty. Emma didn't understand the adult politics that had torn her family apart. She only understood that she was hurt and afraid, and wanted the person who'd always made her feel safe. David looked at his daughter, then at me, then at Jessica, whose face was a mask of barely controlled fury. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, he was being forced to choose between his wife's control and his daughter's clearly expressed need. "Okay," he said quietly, the single word carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. "Okay, Mom can stay." Jessica's expression shifted from fury to something approaching panic. In all her careful planning, in all her systematic destruction of my relationship with my family, she'd never considered that my granddaughter might have her own voice in the matter. She'd never imagined that love might be stronger than manipulation, that a child's honesty might cut through adult deception with devastating clarity. "David, we need to discuss this privately," she said, her voice tight with the strain of maintaining composure in front of hospital staff who were witnessing more family drama than they'd probably seen all week. "There's nothing to discuss," he replied, and for the first time in months, he sounded like the man who'd been raised to believe that family loyalty mattered more than convenience. "Emma wants her grandmother, and she's going to have her grandmother." I squeezed Emma's hand gently and watched Jessica realize that her carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. Not because of anything I'd done, but because love had its own power, its own way of surviving even the most determined attempts to destroy it. It wasn't victory, exactly. There would still be battles ahead, still conversations that needed to happen, still damage that would take time to repair. But sitting beside my granddaughter's hospital bed, holding her small hand while she finally relaxed enough to close her eyes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. I felt like I belonged somewhere again. I felt essential, needed, important to someone who mattered. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like fighting back. That night in the hospital changed everything, but not in the way Jessica expected. While Emma slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, her small hand still holding mine, I watched my son begin to see his wife clearly for perhaps the first time since their marriage. It started with small things. The way Jessica checked her phone constantly instead of focusing on her injured stepdaughter. The way she made business calls from the hospital corridor. Her voice carrying through the thin walls as she discussed weekend plans and shopping appointments while her family dealt with crisis. The way she looked at me, not with concern for Emma's well-being, but with calculating anger at having her control challenged. David noticed. I could see him watching his wife's behavior with the dawning awareness of someone who'd been blind for so long that sudden sight was almost painful. When Jessica suggested they could take shifts, staying with Emma so she wouldn't miss her yoga class the next morning, something shifted in his expression. "She's staying overnight for observation because of a head injury," he said quietly. "I think yoga can wait." "I'm just trying to maintain some normalcy," Jessica replied, but her voice carried a defensive edge that suggested she knew how callous she sounded. "It's not healthy for any of us to put our entire lives on hold because of one accident." One accident. As if Emma's injury was a minor inconvenience rather than a terrifying reminder of how quickly everything that mattered could be threatened. I saw David flinch at his wife's choice of words, saw him really look at the woman he'd chosen over his mother for the first time in months. By morning, Emma was cleared to go home, but something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamics. David carried his daughter to the car with the protective gentleness of a father who'd been reminded that children are fragile gifts, not possessions to be managed. He insisted I ride with them instead of driving myself, a small gesture that Jessica clearly resented but couldn't oppose without looking even more unreasonable than she already did. The drive to their house felt surreal after weeks of exile. I sat in the back seat with Emma, who chattered about the hospital breakfast and the nice nurse who'd brought her extra apple juice, as if the past month of separation had been nothing more than a brief interruption in our normal relationship. Her resilience amazed me, but I could see the subtle signs of the damage that had been done, the way she kept touching my hand to make sure I was really there, the way she asked 3 times if I would still be there when she woke up from her nap. When we arrived at the house, Jessica made one last attempt to reestablish her authority. "I think it would be best if Maria just visits for a few hours today," she announced as David carried Emma inside. "We don't want to overwhelm Emma with too much change all at once." But Emma, still groggy from her medication but alert enough to understand what was being discussed, spoke up with the clear voice of a child who'd learned not to trust adult promises. "I want Grandma Maria to stay. She said she wouldn't leave me again." David looked at his daughter, then at me, then at his wife, and I watched him make a choice that would define the kind of father he wanted to be. "Mom's staying," he said simply. "Emma needs stability right now, and Mom provides that." The word stability hung in the air like an accusation. Jessica's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, before settling on the kind of forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, her voice artificially bright. "Whatever's best for Emma." But I could see the wheels turning behind her polite facade, could almost watch her recalculating her strategy now that her husband was no longer completely under her influence. Jessica wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully, and I knew this temporary setback would only make her more determined to find another way to eliminate me from their lives. Over the next 2 days, as I helped Emma recover and readjust to having me present again, I watched Jessica with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to underestimate an opponent. She was subtle in her renewed campaign. Little comments about how attached Emma was becoming, suggestions that my presence might prevent Emma from developing proper independence, observations about how difficult it would be to transition again when I eventually had to leave. She was planting seeds, preparing David for the next phase of her manipulation. But she'd made a crucial error in her calculations. She'd underestimated how much the hospital experience had opened David's eyes to what really mattered. And she'd forgotten that I was no longer the desperate, broken woman she'd expelled from her home a month ago. I'd learned things during my exile. I'd learned that rock bottom has a certain clarity that comfortable lives don't provide. I'd learned that when you have nothing left to lose, you stop being afraid of conflict. Most importantly, I'd learned that love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it has to be fierce to survive. So I began to prepare, not for another confrontation or dramatic scene, but for something more subtle and far more effective. I started documenting things. The way Emma clung to me after nightmares that had started during my absence. The way she asked constant questions about whether I was leaving again, whether I still loved her, whether the promises adults made could be trusted. The way David looked more relaxed and happy than he had in months, now that he didn't have to choose between his wife and his family. I also started paying closer attention to Jessica's behavior, really watching instead of just enduring. I noticed how she spoke to David when she thought no one was listening. The subtle criticisms, the way she undermined his confidence in his own decisions, the constant references to what we had decided when it was clear that we meant Jessica had decided, and David had agreed. I saw how she interacted with Emma when she thought I wasn't watching. Not cruel exactly, but distant, as if her stepdaughter was a responsibility to be managed rather than a child to be loved. I heard the phone conversations where she complained to friends about how difficult it was to have me back in the house, how she was being so patient with David's mother issues. Most revealing of all, I overheard her talking to her own mother one evening when she thought I'd gone to bed. The conversation was illuminating in ways Jessica couldn't have intended. "It's temporary," she was saying, her voice carrying the confidence of someone discussing a minor setback, rather than a fundamental challenge to her authority. "David feels guilty about the accident, but that will pass. I just need to be strategic about this. Maybe find a way to show that Maria is becoming too dependent, too involved in our lives. Something that proves she's the problem I've always said she was." The casual calculation in her voice, the way she spoke about manipulating her husband's guilt and my love for my granddaughter, confirmed everything I'd suspected about her motivations. This wasn't about protecting her marriage or creating healthy boundaries. This was about control, pure and simple. Jessica couldn't tolerate anyone in David's life who might influence his decisions or challenge her authority. But she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd allowed me back into their lives, which meant I was no longer operating from a position of complete powerlessness. I had access again. I had Emma's love and David's renewed respect. I had a foundation from which to rebuild the relationships she'd tried so hard to destroy. More importantly, I had time to plan, time to think about what I'd learned during my weeks of exile, about who I really was when stripped of everything familiar and comfortable. I'd discovered reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed, a core of determination that couldn't be broken by rejection or humiliation, or even the temporary loss of everything that had given my life meaning. Jessica thought she was dealing with the same woman she'd expelled a month ago. Desperate, dependent, easily manipulated by threats to her access to family. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all, and that sometimes protecting the people you care about means fighting for them, even when they can't fight for themselves. On my third night back in their house, I sat in Emma's room after reading her to sleep, listening to her peaceful breathing, and thinking about the future I wanted to build for all of us. Not the future where I existed at Jessica's sufferance, walking on eggshells and grateful for whatever scraps of family connection she was willing to allow me. Not the future where Emma grew up believing that love was conditional and family bonds could be severed by adult convenience. I wanted the future where my granddaughter understood that some promises are sacred, where my son remembered who he used to be before fear made him small, where families protected each other instead of sacrificing the vulnerable to maintain the comfortable. Jessica had taught me something valuable during my exile, though I doubted she'd intended the lesson. She'd shown me that waiting for other people to do the right thing was a strategy that led nowhere but disappointment. She'd demonstrated that sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to stop being polite and start being strategic. I was done being the victim in this story. It was time to remind everyone involved that grandmothers don't become grandmothers by being weak, and mothers don't raise successful children by being easy to dismiss. Some battles are worth fighting, and some people are worth fighting for. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But this time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. And I wouldn't be fighting from a position of weakness. This time, I had something Jessica had never possessed and could never understand: the unshakable foundation of unconditional love and the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're willing to do to protect the people who matter most. The moment I'd been preparing for came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Emma's accident. Jessica had been growing increasingly frustrated with my continued presence in their home, and I could see her patience finally reaching its breaking point. She'd tried subtle manipulation, passive-aggressive comments, and even direct requests for me to leave, but David's newfound awareness of his daughter's needs had made him resistant to his wife's pressure. That morning, while David was at the grocery store and Emma was playing in her room, Jessica decided to make one final attempt to reassert control. She found me in the kitchen, where I was preparing Emma's favorite pancakes, something I'd done countless times before my exile. A simple ritual that represented the stability Jessica couldn't tolerate in anyone but herself. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once wielded so effectively over both David and me. "This arrangement isn't working anymore." I continued mixing the pancake batter, keeping my movements calm and measured. During my weeks of exile, I'd learned the power of not reacting immediately to provocation, of maintaining composure while others lost theirs. "Which arrangement is that?" I asked mildly, not looking up from my work. "Don't play games with me, Maria. You know exactly what I'm talking about. This whole situation with you living here, with Emma becoming so dependent on you again. It's not healthy for anyone involved." I poured the first pancake into the hot skillet, watching as it bubbled and began to set around the edges. "Emma seems pretty healthy to me. Happy, secure, sleeping through the night for the first time in a month. David seems more relaxed, too." "That's exactly the problem," Jessica snapped, her carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. "You're making them dependent on you again. You're undermining the family structure that David and I have worked so hard to build. The family structure, I repeated, finally looking at her directly. You mean the structure where you decide who gets to love whom, and when, and how much? Her face flushed with anger at my directness. During my previous time in their house, I'd always been careful to avoid direct confrontation, to keep peace at any cost. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that peace without justice was just another form of surrender. I mean the structure where David's wife gets to have some say in how our household is run, she said, her voice rising slightly, where we get to make decisions about our family without outside interference. Outside interference? I flipped the pancake with steady hands, though my heart was racing. Is that what you call a grandmother loving her granddaughter? I call it manipulation, Jessica said, stepping closer to where I stood at the stove. You're using Emma to get back into this house, using her accident to make David feel guilty about setting boundaries. It's emotional blackmail, and I won't tolerate it anymore. The accusation hung in the air between us, so perfectly reversed from reality that it would have been funny if it weren't so destructive. Jessica, who had systematically manipulated my son into abandoning his mother, was accusing me of manipulation for loving my granddaughter. Is that what you're going to tell David? I asked, sliding the pancake onto a plate and pouring another one. That his mother is manipulating his daughter by reading her bedtime stories and making her breakfast. I'm going to tell David the truth, she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd successfully rewritten reality before and believed she could do it again. That having you here is confusing Emma, making her think she can manipulate adults by expressing preferences for one caregiver over another. That you're undermining our authority as parents and creating an unhealthy dynamic. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something I'd missed before. Fear. Not the fear of someone who was genuinely concerned about family dynamics, but the fear of someone who was losing control and didn't know how to regain it. Jessica had built her marriage on being the only source of emotional support and guidance David needed, and my presence threatened that carefully constructed dependency. You're afraid, I said quietly. Excuse me? You're afraid that if David remembers what it feels like to have family who loves him unconditionally, he might start questioning what you've convinced him he needs to sacrifice to keep you happy. Jessica's composure cracked completely then, revealing the calculating anger beneath her veneer of concerned motherhood. You don't know anything about my marriage or what David needs. You've been nothing but a burden since the day we got married. Always hovering, always interfering, always making him feel guilty for having his own life. His own life, I repeated, flipping the second pancake. You mean the life where he's not allowed to have a relationship with his mother? Where his daughter can't have a relationship with her grandmother? Where family loyalty has to be sacrificed to protect your insecurities? I am not insecure, she snarled, but her voice betrayed her. I'm protecting my family from someone who can't accept that she's not needed anymore. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps stopping just outside the kitchen doorway. Neither Jessica nor I had heard David return from the store, but there he was, grocery bags in his hands, listening to his wife describe his mother as an unwanted burden who needed to be eliminated from their lives. I could see him from where I stood at the stove, though Jessica's back was to the doorway. His face went through a series of expressions as he processed what he was hearing: surprise, recognition, and something that looked like the final pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Go ahead, I said to Jessica, my voice calm despite the magnitude of what was happening. Tell me more about how protecting your family requires destroying mine. Your family? Jessica's voice rose to a near shriek. David is my husband. Emma is my daughter. This is my house. You have no family here. You're just a lonely old woman who can't accept that she's not wanted anymore. The cruelty in her voice, the deliberate attempt to wound me with words designed to make me feel worthless and disposable, echoed through the kitchen like a confession. Everything I'd suspected about her motivations, everything I'd endured during my weeks of exile, was laid bare in that moment of unguarded honesty. David stepped into the kitchen then, setting his grocery bags on the counter with deliberate care. Jessica spun around, her face going pale as she realized how much he'd heard. David, she said quickly, switching to the tone she used when she needed to manage his reactions. "I was just trying to explain to your mother that this living situation isn't sustainable long-term." "I heard," he said quietly. "I heard all of it." For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the sizzle of pancake batter in the hot skillet, a domestic noise that seemed absurdly normal in a moment that was redefining everything about how this family would function going forward. "How long?" David asked, looking at his wife with the expression of someone who was seeing her clearly for the first time. "How long what? How long have you felt this way about my mother? How long have you been planning to get rid of her permanently?" Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. "David, you're misunderstanding. I was just frustrated. I said things I didn't mean." "No," he interrupted, his voice carrying a firmness I hadn't heard from him in months. "I think for the first time in a long time, you said exactly what you meant. The question is, how long you've meant it." Emma's voice drifted down from upstairs, calling for her daddy and asking if the pancakes were ready yet. The sound of her innocent joy, her assumption that her family would be intact and happy when she came downstairs, added weight to the moment that was deciding her future. "She needs to leave," Jessica said desperately, pointing at me as if I were some kind of threat rather than the woman who'd helped raise the child calling from upstairs. "Can't you see what she's doing? She's trying to turn you against me, trying to break up our marriage." David looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw recognition in his eyes. Not just of who I was, but of who I'd always been, the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him, who'd never asked for anything but love in return, who'd been willing to disappear from his life rather than cause him pain. "The only thing breaking up our marriage," he said to his wife, his voice heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade, "is the fact that you made me choose between my wife and my mother. And I was fool enough to think that was a choice I should have to make." Jessica's face crumpled as she realized that her careful manipulation had finally backfired, that her attempt to eliminate me from their lives had instead revealed the ugly truth about what their marriage had become. But there was no remorse in her expression, only the frustrated anger of someone whose plans had been thwarted. "Fine," she said, her voice venomous. "Choose her. But don't expect me to stay here and watch you destroy everything we've built together." She stormed out of the kitchen, leaving David and me standing in the sudden silence, both of us processing what had just happened and what it meant for all of our futures. Emma's voice called down again, more insistent this time, asking if breakfast was ready and could she please come downstairs now. Life was demanding to continue, requiring us to figure out how to move forward from this moment that had changed everything. David looked at me, and for the first time in months, I saw my son clearly. Not Jessica's husband or Emma's father, but the boy I'd raised who'd somehow lost his way and was just now finding his path back to the values I'd tried to teach him. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, and the words carried the weight of everything that had been broken and everything that might still be repaired. David's apology hung in the air between us like a bridge we both needed to cross, but weren't sure how to navigate. 28 years of being his mother, 5 years of being dismissed and undermined, 4 weeks of exile, and now this moment where everything could be repaired or lost forever. "I know sorry isn't enough," he continued, his voice breaking slightly as he struggled with words that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what had happened. "I know I can't take back the things I said, the way I let her convince me that choosing my wife meant abandoning my mother." Emma's footsteps sounded on the stairs, and we both knew that whatever we said next would have to include her, would have to acknowledge that this was about more than just adult relationships and hurt feelings. This was about the kind of family we wanted to be, the kind of love we wanted to model for a child who was watching everything and learning what promises meant. "Daddy, Grandma Maria," Emma burst into the kitchen with the enthusiasm of a child who believed the world was fundamentally good and fair, who expected to find her family intact and happy around the breakfast table. "Are the pancakes ready? I'm so hungry I could eat a whole elephant." I looked at this beautiful child, my granddaughter who'd been caught in the crossfire of adult conflicts she'd never deserved to experience, and felt something settle into place in my chest. Not forgiveness, exactly. That would take time and effort from all of us. But something more immediate and necessary. The absolute certainty that she would never again be used as a weapon in battles between the adults who were supposed to protect her. "The pancakes are ready, sweetheart," I said, lifting her onto the counter where she'd always loved to sit while I cooked, her small legs swinging as she chattered about her plans for the day. "And guess what? We're going to have a very special breakfast today." "Why is it special?" she asked, accepting the small piece of pancake I offered her to taste test, her face lighting up with the simple pleasure of warm food and family attention. "Because," David said, finding his voice and his role in this moment, "we're going to talk about some changes in our family. Good changes." Emma looked between us with the serious expression children wear when they sense important adult conversations, but aren't sure how they're supposed to react. "Is Mommy Jessica going to come eat pancakes too?" The question we'd all been avoiding, delivered with the innocent directness that only children possess. David and I exchanged glances, and I saw him grapple with how to explain adult failures to someone who deserved age-appropriate honesty without devastating details. "Mommy Jessica and I need to have some conversations about our family," he said carefully. "She might not be living here for a while we figure some things out. But you and Grandma Maria will still be here, right?" Emma's voice carried the anxiety of a child who'd already experienced too much instability, who needed reassurance that the foundation wouldn't disappear again. "Yes," I said firmly, looking at David to make sure we were in agreement. "Grandma Maria is staying, and Daddy is staying. We're your family, and we're not going anywhere." David nodded, and in that nod was a promise that went beyond the immediate crisis, beyond the damage that had been done. It was a commitment to rebuild what had been broken, to create something stronger than what we'd had before. Over the next few weeks, as Jessica moved out and filed for divorce with the vindictive efficiency of someone who couldn't tolerate losing control, our small family learned how to function again. It wasn't always easy. David carried guilt about the choices he'd made, about the month I'd spent homeless while he convinced himself that abandoning his mother was the price of marital peace. Emma struggled with nightmares and questions about why families sometimes broke apart and whether promises could really be trusted. But we worked through it together, day by day, conversation by conversation, pancake breakfast by pancake breakfast. I moved back into the guest room that had never really stopped feeling like home. And slowly, carefully, we rebuilt the trust that Jessica's manipulation had nearly destroyed. David went to therapy, something he'd resisted during his marriage but embraced now as a necessary part of understanding how he'd lost himself so completely. He talked about guilt and manipulation, about the difference between healthy boundaries and emotional isolation, about how to be a good husband without sacrificing his role as a son and father. "She made me believe that loving you meant I was weak," he told me one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, Emma coloring at the kitchen table while we talked. "She convinced me that a real man puts his wife first, even if it means cutting off everyone else who loves him." "And now?" I asked, not because I needed reassurance, but because he needed to voice what he'd learned. "Now I understand that love isn't supposed to require you to sacrifice other love. A woman who really loves you wants you to have strong relationships with your family, not to be isolated and dependent on only her." It was a hard-won wisdom, the kind that comes from making painful mistakes and choosing to learn from them rather than repeat them. I was proud of him for doing the work, for facing the uncomfortable truths about how he'd been manipulated and how he'd allowed that manipulation to hurt the people who'd loved him longest. Emma recovered too, with the resilience that children possess when they're surrounded by adults who prioritize their well-being over their own comfort. She started sleeping through the night again, stopped asking anxious questions about whether I was leaving, began to trust that the promises we made were promises we intended to keep. 6 months after Jessica's departure, Emma and I were reading in her room when she looked up from the book we were sharing and asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Grandma Maria, why did Mommy Jessica want you to go away?" I thought carefully about how to answer, knowing that Emma deserved honesty without details that would hurt her understanding of herself or her place in the world. "Sometimes grown-ups get scared," I said finally. "Sometimes they think there isn't enough love to go around, so they try to keep all of it for themselves. But that's not how love works." "How does love work?" she asked, snuggling closer to me on her bed. "Love gets bigger when you share it," I told her, smoothing her hair away from her face. The more people you love, and the more people who love you, the stronger and happier everyone becomes. Love isn't like pizza, where if someone else gets a slice, there's less for you. Love is like singing in a choir, where every voice makes the music more beautiful. She considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important concepts. So, Mommy Jessica was wrong about love? Yes, sweetheart, she was wrong about love. A year later, I was watching Emma play in the backyard when David found me sitting on the porch with my morning coffee, enjoying the kind of peaceful moment that had once seemed impossible to recover. I have something to tell you, he said, settling into the chair beside me with the relaxed posture of someone who no longer carried the weight of impossible choices. Oh? I looked at him with mild curiosity, noting that his expression carried happiness rather than anxiety. I've been seeing someone, he said, and then quickly continued when he saw my eyebrows rise. Her name is Sarah. She's a teacher at Emma's school. She's wonderful with kids, patient, kind. And Mom, she wants to meet you. She says any man who's learning to rebuild his relationship with his mother is someone worth knowing. I smiled, feeling something warm and hopeful settle in my chest. She sounds wise. She is. And she understands that Emma and I come with you, that we're a package deal, and anyone who wants to be part of our family has to understand that family means family. No conditions, no eliminations, no choosing sides. I'd like to meet her, I said, meaning it completely. She'd like to meet you too. She says she wants to learn from the woman who raised a man who's willing to admit his mistakes and do the work to fix them. We sat quietly for a moment, watching Emma chase butterflies in the garden I'd replanted after my return, both of us thinking about how much had changed and how much healing had taken place. You know what I learned through all of this? I said finally. What's that? That sometimes the worst thing that happens to you teaches you the most important lesson you'll ever learn. Jessica thought she was destroying our family when she forced me out. But really, she showed us what we'd forgotten. That love that can be destroyed by manipulation wasn't really love at all. Real love, family love, is stronger than fear and control and jealousy. David reached over and took my hand, his grip firm and warm and completely present. I'm grateful for second chances, he said. Me too, I replied, squeezing his hand back. Emma ran up to us then, breathless and glowing with the simple joy of a summer afternoon, holding a dandelion she'd picked for me. Grandma Maria, look what I found for you. Daddy says if you make a wish and blow all the seeds away, it might come true. I took the dandelion from her small hands and looked at my son and granddaughter, at the home we'd rebuilt together, at the future that stretched ahead of us full of ordinary moments and extraordinary love. I don't need to make a wish, I told her, handing the flower back. Everything I could have wished for is already here. And as Emma blew the dandelion seeds into the warm afternoon air, watching them dance away on the breeze like tiny prayers made visible, I understood that sometimes the best endings aren't about getting revenge on the people who hurt you. Sometimes the best endings are about discovering that love is stronger than cruelty, that family bonds can survive even systematic attempts to destroy them, and that the people who matter most will always find their way back to each other. Some stories end with justice. Some end with forgiveness. Ours ended with something better than either. It ended with love that had been tested and proven unbreakable, with family that had been torn apart and rebuilt stronger, with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the people who'd tried to destroy us had only succeeded in showing us how much we meant to each other. In the end, that was the only revenge I needed. The simple, profound happiness of being exactly where I belonged, with exactly the people I was meant to love.